Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my World 2022 Top 20 Player List and Rankings. This is a video that I know a lot of you have been really excited about in the comments section below. I've been really excited to make it. A couple of ground rules, obviously, before we jump into this. Obviously, if you've watched some of my content before on this channel, you'll know that I'm not always exactly in line with what everybody else is always saying. I definitely have my own opinions, but I do have a few ways that I like to personally tier rank and power rank players. Again, if you've been a fan of this channel for a long time, you'll know I do take into account prolonged success. So if you have continued to prove over and over again throughout the year that you're one of the best players in the world, that to me is more impressive than a great playoff run, for example. But it is important that you show up in big scenarios. Can your team win, and can the team win because of you? And all of those things are going to be calculated here. Now, this video is just going to be 11 to 20, or 20 to 11, I guess you could say, since I'm going backwards. And the next video coming out tomorrow will be 10 to 1. So if you are excited for it, let me know down in the comment section below. A lot of really interesting takes here. I'm going to say this before the video even starts, but this is almost certainly going to be my most controversial video of all time. It is very difficult to rank the top 20 players at Worlds without pissing somebody off for somebody being too low or too high or not on the list at all. There are certainly some players on here that are egregiously not on the list, and so we'll get into that first, actually, here, as the first thing I want to jump into is some of my honorable mentions for the list. And as you can see on the screen, there are a lot of players here that are world-class players. There are significantly more than 20 world-class players in the world right now, and these are the ones to me that just missed out on the cut. You've got Canyon from Damwon Kia, you've got Faker and Gumayushi from T1. Lehens doesn't make this list. He was the 21 for me. I feel really weird, and I can imagine a lot of people already clicking off with Lehens not making this list. Doran doesn't make this list. Berserker had upset some Western players that were very close. Upset, obviously, assuming he plays at Worlds, which he will. He just might not play early at Worlds. Overall, all of these players in other years probably would have a pretty easy shot at getting top 20 in the world, but man, it just feels like the talent level at this year's World Championships is at an all-time high. Canyon was super close for me. Lehens was, like I said, incredibly close. He comes in at number 21, and some people are going to have him top 10, like, actually, and I don't think I can actively fault them for that. I do think that he looks a little bit better because of the team he's on than maybe he is. I'm not saying he's not one of the best supports in the world, but he comes in as the number 4 support at the tournament for me, and I really don't think the difference is all that big, but the top 3, just I felt comfortable about putting them on the list. Players like Doran are, very good players on very good teams, just not the focal point. Same thing with Gumayushi. Faker was really kind of the anti-focal point of T1 this year, so he ends up not making the list. Canyon, like I said, came very close as well. He's probably 22. He doesn't end up making the list just because of the talent level above him. And then Berserker and Upset, just because I wanted to make sure to get some Western representation on at least the honorable mentions. But speaking of Western representation, that leads us into our number 20 spot. And I'm going to spoil it a little bit here. It is the only Western player in my top 20 list coming in here at the number 20 spot. And it is going to be Caps from G2 Esports. I still think he's the best Western player right now. He wasn't perfect in the regular season, certainly not, but he definitely rebounded in playoffs, and at the end of the day, it still is Caps. He comes in here as my number 6 mid laner, my number 20 player overall at the tournament. You'll see it's going to list their, all of these slides are going to list the 3 most played champions from the player during the summer split, that is both regular season and playoffs. It's going to list where I had them on my personal all-pro teams in my playoff primer videos, how many player of the game awards the broadcast gave them, and how many player of the series I gave them. Now, those numbers are definitely going to be disparaging, not just because we have different opinions, but of course there's more games than there are series, at least in terms of the Eastern regions, so those might not always line up exactly perfectly. You're most likely going to see a lot more player of the game awards than you are player of the series. But let's talk about what Caps does for G2 in general. he still is the focal point of that team. Whether you want to talk about that team maybe underperforming a lot in the finals, which they did, they still played a ton around Caps. It's up to Jankos and Caps to be able to generate that lead for G2 because their bot lane, as we saw in those finals, not necessarily the strongest part of the map for them. Top lane is certainly a lane that can be inconsistent with Broken Blade. Caps has to be on his A game for this G2 team to win, and they've really been a team that throughout the year has looked like a team that can compete at the highest level. They're my number 8 team in my power rankings. If you watched my group videos, you will know that, and Caps is a huge reason for that. I still believe he is one of the best players in the world in terms of takeover potential, but he's not just that. He does know how to play as the secondary carry. If you can get Broken Blade or somebody else on this team incredibly online, he's very versatile, he's very smart, and he's very aggressive. He knows exactly how to play his lead, and he has the talent to back it up. There's very, very, very few players in the world that can say that. Now, this is a pretty big drop-off, I would say, for Caps, at least 2022 was in general. I certainly don't think he had the same kind of impact on the game in previous years. I'm thinking back to 2019, 2020. We're looking at Caps as a top 5, top 6 player in the world. I don't know if he's in that conversation anymore. Maybe he can have just a phenomenal World Championships and reassert himself into that conversation, but for now, it's very difficult for me to put Caps any higher than number 20. There are a lot of fantastic, mechanically talented, and smart players in the world. Caps just kind of falls into that right now. If he would have had a more dominant 2020, if he would have ran away with an MVP and G2 was that number 1 seed, he would be significantly higher on this list. G2 was the number 1 seed, but honestly, a lot of the year, it wasn't even because of Caps. That's the reason he didn't even make any of my All-Pro teams, which I did get a ton of flack for in my video, but I think regular season stats, he didn't do it for me. He wasn't the focal point of G2 that he wanted to be. He definitely stepped up in playoffs, but if you're getting the good version of Caps, he is 20 and above, right? The worst version of him is probably where I have him ranked right here around the 20 range. And so theoretically, you could be getting a better version of Caps at Worlds, and that's certainly what G2 is going to be relying on if they want to get out of what is essentially the group of death in Group B, but I just don't know if I'm going to be super confident that they're going to be able to get it. If I'm just going off of what I saw in the regular season, Caps is unfortunately down closer to 20 than he is to 10. Moving on to number 19 here on the list, we've got another big name. We kick it off with probably the best Western player in the world, and we follow it up now with one of the best players of all time coming in at number 19, and that is ShowMaker, the mid laner for Damwon Keria. Now, a lot of people are going to be surprised to see him this low if you really haven't been watching the LCK. Some people who have been watching the LCK heavily might even be surprised to see him this high on the list. He might have been expected to be more of an honorable mention, and honestly, to me, this number 19 spot is a little bit of a shared spot. ShowMaker, Canyon, this really is just kind of the peak Damwon players together here, but I'm going to mostly talk about ShowMaker here. He really had a down split. This was someone who was in the conversation for becoming one of the greatest players of all time over the past few years. 2020 and 2021 were phenomenal years for ShowMaker, and I think last year at the tournament, I would have pretty clearly had him as number 1, as probably the number 1 player in the world going into Worlds. He falls all the way down to number 19 in this year, honestly close to being an honorable mention, and that's just because he really was not the dominant impact force that he has been over the past few years for this Damwon team. He was fine this year overall, certainly wasn't making egregious mistakes, but this team took a really big step back from the dominant LCK force that they have been over the past 2 years, and ShowMaker was a big part of that. Even in a lot of their wins, it very much felt like Canyon was the one that was driving a lot of the success. ShowMaker was just along for the ride. Now, that doesn't take away from the mechanical and laning feats that ShowMaker still is able to accomplish here in this split. He was still phenomenal overall at being able to generate a lead. He just really wasn't domineering in that sense. He was fine. He got 8 Player of the Game awards in the LCK. He was able to receive 2 Player of the Series awards overall, which is good. That's going to be higher than some of the other people that are above him on this list, but overall, he just didn't have the same kind of impact on the map that he had been having in recent years. Now, all of that to say he still is the number 19 player on this list. It's not like he has become a bad player by any stretch of the imagination. I still believe that there is no mid laner in the world that is going to feel entirely confident going into ShowMaker at the World Championships, because this is a player that has consistently shown to be able to show up at the most opportune times possible. He wasn't the most dominant in the regular season, but he had a great gauntlet series against Liv Sandbox, absolutely obliterated closer and made it really, really easy for Damwon to grab this number 3 spot from the LCK at Worlds. Basically, he was a big reason why they were able to skip out on the play-in stage entirely. And if you're going to be getting that version of ShowMaker at a big tournament like Worlds, with some prep time, with some time to prepare, even though, again, another player out of Group B in a really, really tough group, I think ShowMaker is one of those players that we could definitely see show up more on the World stage than he did on the LCK stage. So if he plays closer to a top 5, top 10 player at this tournament, you're certainly not going to see me be surprised at all. It's just, if we're taking into account how he has played throughout the entirety of the year, it's really, really difficult for me to rank ShowMaker any higher than number 19 as my number 5 mid laner at the tournament. Very similar story to what I was talking about with Caps overall. But of course, we're still in a meta where I think ShowMaker can take over. The more supportive roam style meta, I actually do think favors ShowMaker, maybe not in terms of carrying the game, but in terms of having that sort of impact. He's always been a big fan of these more side lane, wave push oriented champions. Obviously, the Rise is ShowMaker's classic, but the TF also something that comes to mind. I'm sure that he's going to be pulling out a lot of the Talia, a lot of the Sylas, and we know he can play it. He did have games this season that were phenomenal on those champions. And so overall, really not all that concerned with ShowMaker, but going into the tournament, it's just very difficult for me to rank him any higher than number 19. Moving on now to number 18. We've covered the first two, and both have been mid laners. That trend is going to change right about now as we move into number 18, and my number 18 player at Worlds is going to be Breathe, the top laner from Royal Never Give Up. Breathe definitely deserves to be on this list. Some people are going to think this is too high, and I can kind of understand that, but I do think that Breathe deserves to be in the top 20 here, purely for his mechanical skill, even if he wasn't the most dominant player on RNG all throughout this year. I think RNG overall has a ton of talent. They really just haven't been able to put it together as a cohesive team, and I'm not really sure the meta fits them all that well, but that doesn't take away from Breathe at all. He is still a phenomenal player, and he has been for many, many years. Back on OMG, he was the shining light for an OMG team that was desperately trying to find anybody to bring them back to relevance. He ends up going to WE last year and really propelling that team into a spot almost at the World Championships. Their entire roster blows up. Breathe goes over to BLG on that super team to start the year, and they end up super underperforming as Uzi can't really get the ball rolling in the way that that organization really needed him to. And then finally, he gets traded over to RNG for Bin. After the spring split, he gets to go on to the spring champions and play through summer. And he was still very, very good. Now, he wasn't the focal point for RNG basically at all throughout the year. And you can see that in my player of the series here. While he did have quite a few player of the game awards, most of that, in my opinion, was because RNG played an absolute absurd amount of 3-game sets this year in best of threes. They didn't have a lot of sweeps overall, and so they ended up playing a ton more games than a lot of the other teams out there. He ended up getting one player of the series for me. I just think that there were a lot of circumstances where he played well, but so did Xiaohu, or so did Ming, or so did GALA. You know, there were a lot of really, really good players on RNG overall, and Breathe, I think, just got, you know, maybe overshadowed by some of the others with player of the series, but talent-wise, he definitely is still up there for me. Definitely more of an aggressive top lane player, someone who I'm not sure if it's going to be the exact meta for him to be able to take over in the same way that he might want to here. Like I said in my meta report video that came out a couple of days ago, I'm expecting a more top lane tank-focused meta with the Maokai, with the Ornn being super popular picks, but luckily for him, Gwen was his most played champion over the course of the year, and Gwen does phenomenally into tanks. I really do think that Gwen is going to be a pick that ends up being the aggressive counter pick to what the meta ends up rolling out here. And if that's the case, I do think RNG and Breathe are in a good spot, but if there are some concessions that need to be taken from the team in order to make things gel a little bit smoother, I can see that being Breathe overall in the top lane. He does come in as my number 3 top laner in the world. Spoiler alert, we're going to be seeing every single one of those in this video here today. No top laners in my top 10. That's how close I think the top lane pool is just generally around the world right now. I don't think that there's any like standout dominant top laners, like top 10 players in the world top laners. I think there are a lot of very, very strong ones, and Breathe definitely falls into that list. So can Breathe propel this RNG team to a much higher expectation than what I see for them in this World Championships? Well, I have RNG at 7 overall in my power rankings. I think Breathe would have to take an absolute masterclass to be the one to push them over that edge, mostly because I'm just not sure he's going to have the option to from his role. But if Breathe comes out and completely balls out, the meta is completely different. We're seeing the Jace, we're seeing the Camille, we're seeing the Gangplank, we're seeing these more aggressive picks come out and dominate. I could see Breathe be incredibly dangerous and difficult to deal with for a lot of the top teams in the world. I'm just not sure that's the exact meta that we're going to be getting. And so for now, Breathe is going to be sitting at number 18, but that certainly isn't a slight on his talent overall. Moving on to number 17 now, we get to move into our first jungler of the list. And our first jungler coming in at number 17 and coming in as the number 4 jungler overall is going to be Oner from T1. He comes in a pretty high ranking here for Oner, as I really think he broke out as one of the best junglers in the world this year. He was really, really good last year as well, but I think this year he really solidified himself as one of the best in the world, not just an up-and-coming one of the best in the world. And a lot of that was just due to his aggressive play in the early game. He really was a big focal point of T1's aggression throughout the early game all year long, especially in spring, where he was genuinely phenomenal. I can't even begin to talk about how good of a spring Oner had overall for T1. Summer, definitely a little bit of a different story just because of the dominance of some of the other teams here, like Gen G, that we're going to be seeing later in the list. But still a very, very good year for Oner overall. He came in second in my All-Pro voting for junglers, only behind Peanut, of course. In the LCK, he got 7 Player of the Game awards. He got 3 of my Player of the Series for T1. Overall, he was a big piece of what they wanted to do. He may not have been the single best player on that team, and we'll reflect that later on in the rankings, but he still was an incredibly integral piece, in my opinion, to one of the best teams in the world, and especially at Worlds, I think his progression is going to be incredibly important for this team to be able to actually beat some of the better teams. They're going to be in a group with EDG, with Cloud9, teams that have aggressive junglers that know how they want to play on the world stage. Oner is going to need to be able to step up and take that big leap into being one of the best players in the world in order for T1 to justify having that number 4 power ranking that I gave them going into this tournament. But that power ranking and this ranking overall of Oner should tell you the confidence that I have in this player and in this team and this organization to be able to prove all of that wrong, to be able to still show up on the world stage and be one of the best teams in the world. Oner, obviously, a lot of Lee Sin, a lot of Viego, a lot of Xin Zhao. What does this tell you? Early aggression. Lee Sin and Xin Zhao are probably the 2 most early aggressive junglers that you can play in the meta right now. Viego, certainly something that wants to take over as well. A lot of this was spring meta as well. Obviously, spring plus summer for these champions, and so overall, a lot of really, really good things out of Oner. He just needs to be able to maintain that, and I really do have a lot of faith that he will be able to do that. It feels like the progression has gone very steady for him, and he has reached the point where he is one of the best junglers in the world. It's not just him being on one of the better teams, and it's not just the LCK region as a whole being weaker, like a lot of people like to say. I really do think that Oner is going to hold up, and I really hope he can prove that to a lot of people here at the World Championships. Moving on to number 16 here on the list, and it's another player that I think a lot of people are going to be surprised to see this high. And honestly, in retrospect, like, I don't think I gave this player nearly enough credit throughout the season for how much of an impact that they had on their team's success. But coming in at number 16 for me is going to be missing the support from JD Gaming, who I really think is a phenomenal player that I just didn't nearly give the same kind of credit to as I did a lot of the other players on JDG, and that's kind of reflected in a lot of the stats that are up on the screen, the quote-unquote stats. No All-Pro selection from me, no Player of the Series from me throughout the year. A lot of that is pretty indicative of just JDG in general and my philosophy towards voting for All-Pro, while missing is, in my opinion, one of the 3 to 5 best supports in the world. I don't know if he was the focal point carry for his team, like some of the other supports in the LPL were this year. I had players like Ming, players like On even, who aren't at this tournament, ahead of him in all-pro voting, purely because it felt like without them, their team wouldn't have been nearly as successful, where Missing was on a phenomenal team with phenomenal players, and a lot of times it felt like they weren't running through Missing in that same way. So it kind of feels like he got a little bit overshadowed throughout the year, but that certainly isn't meant to take away his skill level, and this hopefully is a little bit of a benefit towards that. I think he is one of the best support players in the world, very similar to what we talked about with Breathe earlier. In fact, coming off of the same team last year in WE, that WE team that almost made Worlds, Missing was on there as well. He ends up going to JD Gaming. He is one of the final pieces that team needs in order to push themselves over the edge. Obviously, 369 and Hope also joining over the course of the year. Missing, though, being a huge reason why this team was sitting here as the #1 team in the LPL in general. So what does Missing do really well? Well, honestly, what doesn't he do well? He is an all-around support, and that's why I think he is really consistently great for me and why he was so good last year for WE. You need him to play the engagers. Well, he does that incredibly well, even throughout the split. He was very happy pulling out Nautilus. Obviously, in spring, a ton of Leona. Last year, he was a ton of engagers. He is very good on that playstyle. If he has to be the engage, he's still going to do it at a high level, but he also plays the enchanters incredibly well. Lulu, Yumi, things like that have also been huge picks for JD Gaming. He doesn't really have a niche playstyle that he has to go to. It's really just whatever you need, and in this meta, where it very much feels like there are options at the support position, at least outside of the top 2, I think that's huge. I think that's honestly more important than being dominant at some of the top playstyles, and that's a big reason why he comes in here at number 16. I have a ton of confidence that basically no matter what the meta is, no matter what champions are there, that Missing is going to be able to capitalize and be one of the best supports in the world. He's not meta reliant like some of the other players that we might talk about a little bit more throughout this list, especially at the support position. So why do I think that he comes in ahead of a player like Lehens? Because that's definitely going to be a big conversation surrounding, well, Lehens, first of all, you know, not that I'm going to take this away from Lehens, but it's something to consider. I do think Lehens has a significant amount more help in the bottom lane. Comparing Hope to Ruler, I just don't think is all that fair. Spoiler alert, Hope will not be on my top 20 list. Ruler definitely will be, and so that's certainly something to consider. But even outside of that, I think Lehens is definitely more of a player that focuses on generating that lead early and can sometimes just have these games where he's not all that effective. The up and down variance of Lehens, especially throughout the years, has been very prevalent on teams that haven't been nearly as successful. Yes, when the rest of the team is clicking and when he has a player that he can dump into and when he can play aggressive and get away with it, he looks phenomenal, but I feel like the difference between the two is you put Lehens on a mid-tier team, and he looks like a mid-tier support. You put Missing on a mid-tier team, and I think he makes that team actively better. And that's why I have Missing ahead of him. I don't really think it's that big of a difference. I have Missing as the number 3 support. I have Lehens as the number 4 support. I really don't see the big difference between those two players, but I just know there's going to be a ton of people in the comment section that are aggressively mad at me for not putting Lehens on this list, so I figured I should at least address it here. But overall, Missing, a phenomenal player that I expect to really dominate at this tournament. JDG, again, another player out of Group B. A ton of them already here through the first 5 players on this list. Missing, for me, is going to have one of the biggest impacts. He's going to make all of the bot lanes in that group an incredibly difficult time to actually play into. His laning stats are great. He's really great at roams. He's really great at linking up with Kanavi and making plays, but if they do want to play through Hope, he can do that too. Again, just an incredibly versatile support that I trust to play at an incredibly high level at this tournament. Moving on now to number 15 here on the list. We've gotten through the first 5 in this part 1. It is time to get to the top 5, at least in this part 1 of 20 through 11. And coming in at number 15 and also coming in as my number 4 ranked AD carry at the tournament, I have GALA from RNG, our second RNG player already on this list. And some people are going to see this as too low. I don't imagine a lot of people are going to see this as too high, but I am definitely a little bit lower, I think, generally on GALA than a lot of the other people and other analysts out there. I do think he's a very good player, but a lot of the problems that I have with him, I did outline in my Play-In Group B video that I posted just a couple of days ago, and I'll go over that here as well. I think GALA is an incredibly talented player, and honestly, has the talent to be the #1 ADC in the entire world. The problem with GALA, in my opinion, has always just been his mentality around the game. He plays incredibly passive and safe towards the beginning half of the game, and I think it costs him the ability to dominate in a lot of laning phases like a lot of his contemporaries can. I think we definitely saw that throughout the playoffs this year, and we definitely saw that in the regional finals as well in their series against EDG. That is the reason that RNG, in my opinion, is sitting here as a play-in team and not as a team that was slotted directly into groups, because GALA was just playing significantly too safe. He was playing to go even in the early game against a player like Viper, and Viper was able to take advantage of that. And so GALA, for me, definitely a talented player, but I just need to see that killer instinct come out of him. He was 3rd in my All-Pro team for bot laners in the LPL, even though he only had 1 player of the series for me, and that's because I still think his contribution to this RNG team is incredibly high. His late game dominance is the reason that a lot of people have him as one of the best AD carries in the entire world. If he was just able to take that and translate that into a more aggressive and more tempo pushing playstyle in the early game when he has the opportunity to do so, he would have the full package. It's just right now it doesn't feel like that. He feels very much like a superstar once you get to those team fights on Aphelios, on Jinx, on Zeri, on Sivir, on these champions in the late game that can win you games. He just doesn't always have the most consistent time getting there, especially without jungle intervention. And so overall, GALA is a very, very good player, but someone that I think RNG theoretically could work without. And that's why he does fall to number 15. I do think RNG overall is still a very good team, even though they come in at number 7 in my power rankings. I know a lot of people are very, very high on them, much higher than I am, and I think that's because of the collection of talent that this team has, but GALA, I think, is a little bit of an encapsulation of how I feel about this team, where I do think they have the talent to be one of the top 2, 3, 4 teams in the world. They just have not been able to put it together throughout the year, and I don't really see this being a meta where they're going to do that generally here. Now, if we do get that more early game aggressive meta where Misfortune, Caitlyn are some of the more popular picks in the meta overall, I could see GALA essentially being forced to play a lot more aggro in these lanes, and that could be hugely beneficial to RNG. And if he's starting to play aggressive in the early game, if he's starting to generate 30, 40, 50 CS leads in his own lanes, he's for sure a top 10 player in the world. I just am going to need to see that at the World Championships. More likely for me, he's going to default back to things like the Aphelios, like the Jinx, like he has through a majority of the year, and they're still going to play for him to be their late game hyper carry. Overall, even though I am lower on GALA than a majority of people, he still very comfortably comes into the top 20 for me, and you can see with some of the competition, that is still a huge endorsement of how much I think the talent level of GALA and of RNG generally stands up. I just think that he is capable of so much more, and potentially we could be seeing that if RNG surprises a lot of people at this tournament. Moving on to number 14 now, as we get really into some of the players that I think are genuinely just some of the best in the world. Obviously, that kind of started with GALA, but we really start to get to a point where these are some of the best players at their positions in the entire world. And coming in at number 14 for me, a player that I think has been a little bit overlooked by the community. I think he definitely has not had the best year of his career, but certainly hasn't had the worst, in my opinion. Coming in at number 14 is the number 2 support. It is going to be Keria from T1 here. I still think Keria is one of the best players in the world. I get it. There's like this big hype train that for some reason Keria wasn't all that good this year. And, you know, I'm not going to try to be elitist with this, but like, as someone who watched all the LCK games, I just don't truly understand where that argument comes from. He was at worst a top 2 support in the LCK, like the entire year behind Lehens, and it's for me, he was number 1. I had him as my first team all-pro support, as you can see from the graphic here, because I do think he offered the most for his team. He had an AD carry that was very off and on throughout the split, and yet that lane was incredibly consistent. In the early game, Oner was applying a ton of pressure, and they were able to generate a lot of leads around the bot lane because I think Keria actually played really, really well in a lot of these mid-game skirmishes around objectives and things like that. I think his vision control is unparalleled. I still think his map control as a support is pretty unparalleled. He is still the smartest support in the world, in my opinion, and I really don't think it's all that close. A lot of the things that made Keria one of the best players in the world, he still has. It's not like they've gone away. He just hasn't been nearly as flashy over the course of the year. I see so many analysts not even talking about Keria as one of the top 5 supports at Worlds, and I feel like that is an incredibly disrespectful take to have for this player who I still think is phenomenal. He had 2 Player of the Game awards, he had 1 Player of the Series award, and as you'll find out throughout this list, it's very difficult to get Player of the Series awards as a support overall, because you can be great one game, but it's really hard to be known as the focal point carry for the entire series as a support, at least in the regular season when you're just not playing that macro-oriented style. We see it a lot in playoffs, but not necessarily in the regular season, so those numbers might be a little bit skewed, but I still think Keria is phenomenal and someone who is incredibly underrated. He is very good on the engagers and on the more passive picks. Again, things like the Tom Kench definitely come to mind for T1 as something that they've really pulled out consistently over the course of the year, but obviously Nautilus, things like the Lulu and the Yuumi still are able to be pulled out by T1. Overall, he is flexible. He does definitely lean towards engagers, but he is more flexible than some of the other supports at this tournament. Overall, I just think he's an incredibly good, solid, all-around player that pretty much in any meta is going to succeed purely because his macro is that much better than everybody else he's playing against, and his mechanics are really, really good in lane. If this bot lane can step up and really get back to the form that they were at in spring and not the one that they were at in summer, I think there's a real case to be made that Keria and Guma are some of the best players in the world. Guma doesn't make my list as we saw in the honorable mentions, but Keria does here, and he could skyrocket way past the top 10 where he was after spring if he does have a dominant world championship, which I think he is entirely capable of. And so overall, for T1, I think there's a real case to be made that Keria is the best player on this team. He's not going to be the highest in his rankings, but I think there is a true case to be made that Keria is still the best player on this team and that they're still going to rely a ton on him to be able to be the team that they want to be at this World Championship. All right, getting into the top 3 of this part 1 video, we jump into number 13 on my list now, and it's the number 2 top laner in the world for me. And it's a little bit controversial. It is going to be 369 from JD Gaming coming in as my number 2 top laner and my number 13 player here at the World Championships. Again, a player that I could see a lot of people ranking a lot higher. Again, he had a phenomenal year, and that's reflected in a lot of the stats that are even on the screen right now. First team All-Pro for me, 11 Player of the Game awards from the broadcast, 3 Player of the Series awards from me. The Kennen Master that 369 has always been a absolute joy to watch, but he really revitalized his career over the course of this year. He was really someone that was kind of on the downswing for the last few years after just not having the best year with top esports, getting replaced by Zoom, going to replace Zoom on JD Gaming, and really just being a gigantic upgrade for a team that desperately needed topside pressure, whereas Zoom now is just one of the worst top laners in the LPL, but where this isn't about Zoom, this is about 369. Really got on the team that was perfectly in the position to execute on his playstyle advantages. Obviously, he plays incredibly aggressive, but he's also one of the best team fighters in the world from that top lane position. He's really able to execute on a lot of things from neutral, and I think that's a huge advantage for top laners in general because they're not often going to get a lot of assistance or pressure from their jungler. They're going to need to be able to generate leads either on their own or be able to play from neutral and be able to just outplay the other top laner in late game situations. I think 369 was really consistently able to do that, and that was why I had him as easily the best top laner in the LPL throughout the year. Now, he certainly isn't perfect. He's not someone who is really this, like, game-winning threat every game. And I think a lot of that, again, could theoretically just be the champion pool. We do see a considerable amount of tanks coming out from 369 because I do think it helps JD Gaming a lot. Kanavi plays super aggressive, and Yagao has certainly taken a step up as a playmaker this year, and so 369 is often the one of the 3 that has to take a little bit of a concession in terms of early game pressure, which does mean that he's not going to be able to shine nearly as much as some of the other players here because he is put on weak side duty more often than a lot of the players in the top 15 probably would be. But when he is given those resources, he often makes it look very, very worth it. And I think That's really what it comes down to here, is the fact that 369, when he is given the opportunity to carry the game and to be arguably the best player on JD Gaming at points in time, he definitely comes in clutch and he makes it look easy, and that's why he comes in here at number 13 in my rankings. I think there's going to be some sort of misconception that top 15, top 13 means that I don't consider you one of the best players in the world. If you are top 15 on my top 20 players at Worlds list, you are one of the best players in the world, period, end of story, and I do think that 369 definitely deserves that claim, and he definitely deserves that praise after having maybe the best split of his entire career here with LPL champions JDG. Do I think that he could exceed this ranking at Worlds? Potentially, but I honestly would expect this to go more in the other direction, not because he's a bad player, not because I think he will underperform at Worlds, but again, because if you watch my meta report video, I'm expecting a lot of Ornn, I'm expecting a lot of Maokai from the top lane matchup, and I certainly don't think that he's going to be able to show off his skill in those 1v1 matchups on those champions. I think it's going to be in a very passive state. Our top lane will be in a very passive state throughout most of this tournament, and 369, unfortunately, I think is just going to be victim of that because this team does want to invest resources typically elsewhere, but that does not take away from how good 369 is overall. He proved that over the course of this year over and over and over again, that you put him on a team where he has resources and he has other members of the team that are going to step up and be able to carry. He's going to be phenomenal as a weak side top laner. He's going to do everything that you want out of that role and then some. Moving on now to number 12 in my top 20 player rankings here. We had 369 coming in at number 13, and we have the one top laner that I have above him coming in at number 12 because I do think that these players are relatively close in skill level. Honestly, if you wanted to put one above the other, I certainly wouldn't complain. I flip-flopped a lot on this, but coming in at number 12 and as my number one top laner at Worlds is going to be Zeus from T1. Somehow on a team full of dominant players, some of the greatest of all time, you know, fakers on this team. Obviously, you have players like Keria. You have a player like Oner, who's already been on this list, who I, talked about. Gumayushi's a really good carry. Somehow, amongst all of that, it feels like Zeus has pretty clearly become the best player on this T1 team throughout the year, and doing it in a position that doesn't typically get a lot of resources, especially in the meta that we've been in throughout the year, and I think that is entirely indicative of how good a player I think Zeus actually is. He is someone who comes in at number 12 here, but by the end of this tournament could realistically be coming in at number 8, number 7. He really is that good. Over the course of the next few years, I would expect him to be solidifying his spot as the number 1 top laner in the world, but I feel like I'm a little bit ahead of the curve on this one. Some people are certainly not going to agree with this, but for me, again, if you want 369 here, if you want Zeus here, I think they're very similar right now. I just have more faith in Zeus going forward, and I actually do believe that Zeus is a bigger part of his team's success than 369 is, whereas 369, I think, has better players around him. I think Zeus is the best player on his team, and they're comparable in skill level, so he gets the nod. For me, he was my first team All-Pro top laner in the LCK, 11 Player of the Game awards, 4 Player of the Series awards out of the top lane. This split has been very, very difficult to do. And he's done it on champions that I don't think a lot of people are really expecting to see it on. He's played a ton of Gnar throughout the year, and he's looked great on that. When he wants to go aggressive, he can. Obviously, the Gwen was a gigantic pick for him throughout pretty much all of summer, and that's something I would expect this team to go to very frequently over the course of the tournament. Like I said, Maokai, Ornn, 2 very common picks, but not things that I would really want to put my carry Zeus on. And so if you do want to play that more aggressive top, Gwen is almost certainly going to be the answer in that top lane because of how easily and how well she can deal with tanks in the laning phase. I very much expect Zeus to be pulling that out throughout the tournament, and if they want to invest in him, they absolutely can. They have really controlled the top side throughout the year, T1 that is, and they've done a really good job of making sure Zeus is in a great spot, and he has rewarded them by playing those champions at an incredibly high level. If Jace or someone like that is back in meta as well, we know that is one of the signature champions of Zeus. It was throughout spring, and it was used to absolutely decimate fools throughout the entirety of the spring split through their undefeated run and everything, and so for me, Zeus is incredible, and that should be represented by the fact that he is the number 1 T1 player on this list for me. We've seen Gumayushi and Faker in the honorable mentions. We've seen Keria. We've seen Oner on this list already. Zeus is coming in as the number 1 T1 player, and I do think he deserves it. Can he overperform this ranking at Worlds? He absolutely could. In a meta where things aren't going to be given a lot of attention top lane, I could see T1 investing a lot into that side and having it really, really work out for them, and Honestly, I think that might be their best path to beating some of the teams that might be more consistent against them at this tournament. It's a reason why I think I'm more confident in this team than a lot of other people, because I do have a lot of confidence and a lot of faith in Zeus to be the best top laner in the world. I just really hope he can prove it at his first gigantic international tournament of his career. He's got a lot on the line. He's definitely got a lot of responsibility on a historic organization. It's all about whether or not he can step up to the plate and show that he is ready to handle all of it. That's going to bring us to our number 11 player and the final one of this part 1 top 20 video coming out here today. And number 11 is certainly a divisive one here. Didn't mean to end the video on such a divisive pick, but coming in at number 11 and as my number 3 AD carry at the World Championships, I have JackeyLove from Top Esports. Some people are going to see this as way too low. Some people are going to see this as way too high. And both I kind of understand, because it's JackeyLove at the end of the day. When he is at his absolute best, he is the best AD carry in the world. He is one of the top 5, 4, 3 players in the world. It's the consistency with him, because when he is not at his best, he can actively lose your team games, and we saw that in the LPL finals, where a lot was riding on JackeyLove and his ability to win towards the back half of that game, and he made some critical errors that cost Top Esports a chance to go to Worlds as the number 1 seed from the LPL. Now, that's not indicative of JackeyLove entirely as a player. He was first team All-Pro in the LPL for a reason, even though I didn't have him on any of my All-Pro teams, mostly because Top Esports really didn't feel like they were playing through bot lane all that much throughout the season. Even though he's an incredibly good player, AD carries in the LPL were an incredibly difficult thing. It was between him and GALA for that 3rd spot. Really, you could have him as the 3rd team All-Pro. It really wasn't all that, locked in for me, but there were other teams that just played around that role significantly more than Top did in the regular season. However, when they got to playoffs, when they got to crunch time in these matchups, they invested a ton into JackeyLove, and they essentially hoped that he could carry the games. A lot of times he did. He was really a big reason why they were able to make finals in the first place. But again, sometimes you get good JackeyLove, and sometimes you get bad JackeyLove, and that's the reason he comes in at number 11 and not higher. It's just the consistency with him. If he were at his best throughout the entirety of the year and throughout all these games, I'm pretty clear he would be my number 1 or maybe my number 2 AD carry in the entire world right now. But he comes in at number 3 for AD carries, and he comes in just outside of the top 10 because there are some games that he can just lose, and I don't think that anybody else inside the top 10 really gives you that. Everybody else inside the top 10 has been incredibly consistent throughout the year and incredibly consistent throughout their careers. This is not to take away from what JackeyLove can offer your team, because truly, he can still be one of the best players in the world. And I already talked about this. If you make the top 15, you are a world-class dominant player, and JackeyLove certainly is that at the very least. It's just going to be, can he show that game in and game out? If he walks out of this tournament as easily the number 1 ADC in the world, and Top Esports wins another world championship, or wins a world championship, he gets his 2nd world championship, and everything goes, phenomenal for him, that's a great, great thing on his resume, and honestly, I wouldn't be all that surprised. But if we walk out of this tournament and they were eliminated in quarters because JackeyLove couldn't step up to the challenge, I really wouldn't be all that surprised with that either. And so there's a lot of outcomes with him. That just means that he falls down here to number 11. Obviously, his synergy with Mark has really improved his stock overall. This was someone that I don't think was even relatively in this conversation at the beginning of last year, or throughout last year, but definitely reasserted himself as one of the best AD carries in the world throughout this year. His synergy with Mark, his aggressive playstyle, even on champions, and honestly, especially on champions like Aphelios and Jinx, where he will play them as lane-dominant carries, has been really, really fun to watch, and he certainly makes the games more interesting by being in them. I just don't know if it's conducive to being one of the best players in the world, and so unfortunately, he falls in here at number 11 for me. All right, well, that is going to do it for part 1 of my top 20 players at Worlds list. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this is certainly going to be one of my most divisive videos that I have ever put out. People are not going to be happy about some of the placements on this list, and I can already feel some of the mold in the comment section below. So if you did enjoy the video, I would highly, highly recommend you leave a like to let me know that maybe some of you do enjoy some of the content that I'm putting out here, that some of you do agree with my opinions, and if you don't, I'd love to have that conversation with you guys down in the comment section below. Obviously, I'm not some all-seeing prophet. There's 8 million ways you can look at all of these players and place them because there's so many world-class talented players. Let me know what you think of this part 1 down in the comments section below. I love chatting it up with you guys, and let me know who you expect to see at the top of the list in the next video coming out tomorrow. I'd love to see you guys' predictions and maybe some expectations for what you want to see in that. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.